Here in week 7, we are going to be continuing on from where we left off back in week 6. And so the first thing we want to review is some of the main important parts from week 6 that we are still going to be using this week. So the first few terms that you really have got to know for this class, the variable cost, the costs that change. Remember, with variable costs, they change. Total cost will change with variable, but the per item cost will stay the same. So what that means is if I have a $1, say, golf ball, and every golf ball costs $1, it doesn't matter if I buy 10 or 100, they're all going to cost $1. But what's going to matter is the total cost. It's either going to be $1 times 10 balls or $1 times 100 balls, and that total cost will differ. And the next important key term that we need to know for a managerial type class is the contribution margin. It's something similar to gross profit, but just in how it's calculated. With financial accounting, you take sales minus your cost of goods sold to get your gross profit. Now we're going to split it up just a little differently for managerial, and we're going to take sales minus our variable cost. And then once we have that, we subtract out our regular fixed costs. And remember, the thing with fixed cost is the total costs stay the same. It's the individual per item cost that will continue to go down with the more items we produce. So a quick example again, if instead of doing the per golf balls, if I have just a one-person salary who's making the golf balls, if they make $35,000 and they only make one golf ball, total costs are going to be the same, $35,000. The cost per unit will be $35,000 for one ball. Now, if they make, say, 10 golf balls, the total costs are still $35,000. Didn't change. What did change was our cost per unit. Now, instead of it being $35,000 per golf ball, it's only $3,500. So contribution margin. This is going to allow our managers to see their profit potential, because you're not going to really be able to affect your fixed costs unless you really cut something drastically. The contribution margin ratio, we're going to continue with this as well, knowing just simply the contribution margin ratio is taking what is your contribution margin and then dividing it by your sales. Pretty straightforward, just like your gross profit margin. Break-even point, we need to know that term. We're going to look at that today when we sell multiple units. So the break-even point, where our costs equal our sales, so we make no profit. It's not where we want to be as a business, but it's a starting point where we know we at least have to get to. And then how we figure up what is the break-even in units. So we take our total fixed cost and divide it by our unit contribution margin. Remember, that unit contribution margin is basically this, just for one unit. How much is it? How much can I sell it for? Minus what does it cost me variable cost. So if it was $5 sale price and $3 variable costs, my unit contribution margin would be $2. And then the break even in sales total. All right, so last week we looked at selling one type of unit. This week we're going to look at, well, what if we have different products that we sell and I just want to get an overall break-even point and an overall break-even in sales, not necessarily just per item that I'm selling. So in an example, I've pulled up some different types of gas. I think these are pretty common. We can relate to this. 3 different types of gas, and I want to know, weighted average, how much do I need to sell in total to at least break even? And the first thing we need to do is find our sales mix. So our sales mix is basically looking at everything I'm selling and then finding a percentage of how much of that one item am I selling compared to all of the items. So for the regular gas, I sell 7,000 gallons compared to, if I add up everything here, that's 10,000. So my sales mix for the regular gas would be 70%, 20% for the super and 10% for the premium. Next, here's some of the things that we're going to need to get to the basic, where I want to get to, the weighted average contribution margin. I was able to figure out my sales mix. That's pretty easy. The only other thing I need to figure up is the unit contribution margin, and we did that back just a second ago in our review. The unit contribution margin is simply what am I selling it for minus how much did it cost me to get in that item, not including the fixed costs. Contribution margin is just your sales minus your variable cost. So to get my weighted average contribution margin, because this weighted average contribution margin, yeah, it's my contribution margin for just the regular is $1, 2 minus the 1. Well, for the super, it goes up a little bit. My contribution margin is $1.15, where for the premium, it's up to $1.30. Basically what I'm getting at now is with all three of these different items, think of it like when we do FIFO and LIFO in Accounting 101, the weighted average is kind of the middle of everything. So it's going to be higher than $1 because these guys are higher, but it's not going to be nearly as high as $1.30 because I don't sell very much of the premium. So now we can figure out, now that we've got steps 1 and 2, we can go ahead and figure out what the weighted average contribution margin for the entire sales of our company. So let's look at how we can do this, and then we'll get to answer our final couple questions for the break-even point. So our contribution margin per unit was $1 for the regular, $1.15 for the super, and $1.30 for the premium. Now in my formula, I tell us if we take that dollar times the sales mix for each of them, $1.15 for the 20% sales mix, if we take those and do a multiplication here, regular gas we're going to get 70 cents, super 23, premium 13. When we add those all together, this is my new weighted average contribution margin. So I'm getting more than just the dollar, but not a lot more. So on average, I'm going to bring in $1.06 per gallon. Most of them are going to be in the dollar range, but these couple higher ones will make my average go up just a little bit. Now that we have our weighted average contribution margin, I can now get my break even for the entire company. Because remember, to get break even, just our review, fixed costs divided by our unit contribution margin. Well, now we no longer necessarily are going to do it by unit. We're going to do it by the whole group contribution margin. So I tell us in the problem, fixed costs are $20,000. Divide that by my new weighted average contribution margin, and it's going to average out that if I sell a total of these 18,868 gallons, I'm going to break even. And then I can further then say, okay, 18,000, that's nice, but how much of each do I have to sell? Then I simply just break it back down between the sales mix. So if I have to sell 18,868 gallons, multiply that by the 70% that needs to go to regular, 20% that need to go to super, and then premium. When you add them all up within a very close rounding distance, you should equal how many gallons you're going to sell. It's just how they're spaced out. So now I wanted to take the same example and just show how things are going to be different if my sales mix is different. If I sell quite a bit more of the super and the premium, that's going to cause my contribution margin to go up. So I'm going to get more money per gallon that I sell. And if I get more money per gallon, that means my break even is going to go down, which is always better. I want to sell more if I can, as long as there's no other as long as there is no other factors that need to weigh in, which we're going to look at in a little bit. I want to sell these higher price items if at all possible. So let's look at that. The only thing that's going to change is how the 10,000 gallons are distributed. So now my regular is only 40% instead of 70%, and the other two are at 30%. So when I do the same steps as above, contribution margin didn't change. Now I get my weighted average contribution margin for all three and then add them up. And then I can compare. I'm making 7.5 cents more per gallon on average. If I'm making 7.5 cents more, that's going to take my total gallons that I need to sell to break even down over 1,200 gallons less. So that's quite a difference just by the distribution. And then I could get my break even 40%. I need to sell 7,000 gallons to get 40% of this number for my regular gas. I could also then, this is my break even in gallons. I can easily turn that now into, I can do it different ways to get your break even in sales dollars. This is the way that makes the most sense for me. I simply just take how many gallons that I have to sell times the sale price, which was $2, and then do the same for each one of the premium and the super. Add them up. I need to sell $39,205 to break even. That's going to cover my variable costs plus my fixed costs. And we could then prove that out if we wanted to. We would need to take, all right, total sales, and then I would need to go through and, well, let's go ahead and just do that right now. I always like to prove, because just seeing the 39, you say, okay, well, he says it's 39, that must be right. But I want to make sure it's right. So my sales are 39,205. What are my variable costs? Well, my variable costs are going to be, I'm going to have to break these down. So I'm going to leave some space out here. Variable costs for the regular, remember those were $1. If we go back up to my normal information here, my variable costs were $1 for the regular. So $1 times, and I said I had to sell 7,048 gallons, so that cost is pretty easy to add up, 7,048. My variable cost for the super was $1.10, so if I take 5,286 times $1.10, and let's bring up my calculator. $5,286 times 1.1. So my variable cost here are 58. We'll round it 58.15. And then my variable cost for the premium, and it had a cost of $1.20. So if I take 52.86 times $1.20 each, let's do that. 52.86 times 1.2, 63.43. Now I want to total up my variable costs. Let's put that over here in my total column. All right, I got the 63.43 plus the 58.15 plus the 70.48, and we got 19,206. Now we go ahead and get a new total, our contribution margin, and that's pretty easy math here. That comes out to almost exactly 20,000. So we take the 39,205, 19,999 to get it specifically, and then when you subtract out your fixed costs, which I told us at the very beginning was 20,000, my net income is practically zero. That's what I want to get. I want a net income of zero when I'm doing break even. So I always like to be able to prove things. All right, so our whole goal here, we wanted to determine the break even in sales. So it's, for some companies here, there are thousands of different units, so it may not be realistic to go through each one. We can do this weighted average and kind of get a better idea of just a big scheme, big picture type of items. And then I kind of recap here what we need to do to get each piece as we go through to get our total break even in sales or our break even in units. Okay, let's So using these answers, the sale of gas per unit. Oh, this was just another way to get, I forgot what I was doing here. This is just the other way to get the break even in sales dollars by finding, remember with break even in sales dollars, if you do it the other way, because there's two ways of doing it. If you get your contribution margin ratio, then you can get a weighted average contribution margin ratio when you multiply these guys together. 40% times 50% gives you the 20% all the way through. Add them up, and then you take your fixed costs divided by your contribution margin, your average here ratio, and within very close rounding, we're going to get the same. So 39,270 versus 39,205. So pretty close. Now at this point, it would be good for you to practice this one. I'm not going to show the answers. We'll go through this one in class, but this will be a good one to try to practice if you want, or wait till class. Our next part here is I wanted to get into not for you to get into the habit to think whatever the highest contribution margin is, that's the item I want to sell, just like with the premium gas. The premium gas brought us in $1.20 of income compared to regular, which was only $1. Or I think maybe it was $1.30. I think it was $1.30 contribution margin compared to $1. So you think, I want to sell as much premium as I can because that's where I make the most money. Not always the case. And we're going to go through that here, an example using the gas again. So when we're working with limited resources, things that are going to come into play, even if I make a lot of money on one particular unit, if that one particular unit causes me to have to use a lot of space or a lot of materials, a lot of special labor, lots of different things can come into play where it may not always be the best. And one thing I like to contribute this to, and I may have this somewhere, but I don't think I have it in my notes. Think of it as traveling. A lot of you will, if you travel to a big city, say Indianapolis, that your best route that you feel is going to get you to somewhere is the interstate. You can go fast, there's no stoplights, and it's pretty much a direct route. Now that's the case for a lot of times. But if you try to use the interstate at 6:30, between 6:30 and 8 a.m., or during the evening rush hour, the interstate may not be your best option because of the limited resources. You can only fit so many cars on the interstate. It may be better. You may have a couple extra stop signs or stoplights if you take the back roads. But with the less congestion, it may actually be better for you to take the slower route over the route that's going to take you maybe more miles or more time, just regular, but without this limited resource, the interstate could be shut down. You may not even be able to move for a little while. So it's not always your best option. That's the same thing here. The one with the higher contribution margin isn't going to always be your best option. So that's what we want. That's what we need to look at here. Item may be profitable, but if it takes a lot of time, effort, it may not be worth it. So let's go back to our example. And the item that the new piece that we need to throw in here is you can think of it as like a bottleneck, but the terminology here used is limited resources. Determine the limited resource, and our limited resource is going to be, we're going to say it's labor hours. We can only hire and have this many people around for this many hours, whatever it is, over a week or over a month. And so I need to then know, how much time does it take me to make each type of gas? And so we've went through and done all the tests, and it takes me 0.2 hours. So roughly, 0.1 hour would be 6 minutes. So 12 minutes to make a regular gallon of gas. So for the super, it's going to take 18, and for the premium, 24 minutes to make 1 gallon of gas. So what I want to look at then, if I make $1, remember back up to the contribution margin, this step 3 is going to help me determine which item is best when I have a limited resource. If I have unlimited labor hours and I could work as many people as I want, however long I want, then of course the premium's the best. But if I have something that's going to stick me and I'm going to have to work around it, then I got to do this next little step. I got to say, all right, my unit contribution margin for each one, I already knew those back from the very beginning. But now I need to divide that by my limited resource. This is going to tell me then how much money am I going to be making per hour. So if I make $1 per gallon and and it only takes me 2/10 of an hour, so 12 minutes, I add those up and I can do 5 12 minutes. If you break out the hour, 12 plus 12, 5 times, that's 60 minutes. So I can make $5 in an hour. Whereas with the super, yes, I'm making more per gallon, but I can only make so many gallons in an hour. I can only make a third. I can do a third, which is the 0.3 in an hour. I can make 1 gallon. In a third of an hour, I can make 1 gallon. So if I take the 115 and multiply and divide it out over a third of an hour, I'm only making $3.83 on an hourly basis. This third of an hour, think of that, remember, that's 18 minutes. So 18 plus 18 plus 18 doesn't quite get me to 60, so I can then tack on a little bit more, a partial gallon. Think of it like the equivalent units we did back in week 3. So I'm doing okay, but I'm not doing as well as I did here. Premium takes even more time, and I don't make as much to cover up the extra time that it costs. So in 0.4 hours, I can only make 2.5 gallons. So 2.5 times this number is the same thing that I'm doing in my equation here. I'm only bringing home $3.25 compared to the 5. So based on the labor, it is better with my limited resource to go ahead and make the regular gas, even though I don't make as much per gallon. All right, operating leverage. We got just 2 more pieces that we're going to look at this week. This week should be not nearly as much stuff as last week, where we learned a whole bunch of new stuff. This operating leverage, how does a company's net income react to a change in sales? So what this is looking at is, if I have a 10% bump in sales, does that mean automatically that my net income is going to also bump up 10%? And the answer is no. It all depends on my fixed costs. Fixed costs play a huge role. Sometimes fixed costs are good. Sometimes fixed costs are not good. And it all depends on your amount of sales. And let's break that down. If, for example, I have a company that's full of robots, I had to buy all those robots, and I'm going to have to eat that cost no matter if I sell 100 units or 1,000,000 units. So the fixed costs is a big deal. If I only sell 100 units, I'm going to have to display all those robot costs over just a few items that I made. Whereas if I have 1,000,000 units, I can display those costs over those robots who can do the same job, whether it's 100 units or 1,000,000 units. In that case, the fixed cost is a good thing, because I'm not continually racking up costs for each item that I'm making. Where on the other hand, if I have only human labor, if I only make 100 units, I can scale back to just 1 guy and just pay 1 person. Whereas if I have 1,000,000 units, I'm going to have to ratchet it up to maybe have 1,000 workers, and each worker comes more costs. So and in that case, with the human labor, it's more variable. The more items I make, the more people I have to hire, so therefore I have more costs. But with the robots, I don't. Whether I make 100 or 1,000,000, I guess that's a really big extreme. I get that. But my fixed costs are going to be the same, so therefore, if I make every dollar I make in a robot setting above my break even, it's going to really help my net income. But every dollar I don't make under break even really hurts it. So let's work through an example to help make that make sense. So think of this, okay, high fixed costs, more risk, more reward. If you've heard that before, that's from when you think of the Accounting 101 when we talk about stocks. common stock has the high risk, high reward. Same with fixed costs. As long as you hit that break-even point and you continue to go up, your reward's going to go up. But if you don't even hit your break-even point, your net income is going to go down and go down fast. So when sales are high, the costs remain pretty much the same as if the sales were low. So when the costs remain the same and you're making more money, all the better. You're going to have to pay off those expensive robots no matter if you have high sales or low sales. So a downturn in the economy is going to really, really hurt a company that has high fixed costs. A low fixed cost, just the opposite. If the company does really, really well in sales, well, their net income isn't going to necessarily show it as much. They have a lot less risk, but also a lot less reward. But in a time of a down economy, they can lay people off and not have to have such a hard time to cover their costs. So one isn't always the better, kind of like renting and owning a home. Sometimes renting can be pay off, sometimes owning can pay off, or with a car, taking a lease. So let's look at how this degree of operating leverage works so you can kind of get an idea of where a company might stand. Is a higher number better or lower number? So this illustrates how much a company's net income will rise or fall based on my sales percent change. So if my sales go from 100 to 200, that's a 100% increase. But does that necessarily mean my net income is going to go up 100%? No, it doesn't. So a degree of operating leverage, very simple. The formula, take your contribution margin divided by your net income. And then the key here is the higher your answer, the higher your degree of operating leverage is, the more flux you're going to have. So you're more risk, but you're more reward. So the higher final number you get, anything maybe like 3 or above is a pretty risky company, but it could also really pay off for you. So let's look at this example between Joe Supply and Mike Supply. All right, so Joe, here's my sales. When it's all said and done, Joe and Mike both have the exact same net income. So at first you might think the degree of operating leverage would be very similar, the same. They have the same sales. And when it's all said and done, they have the same net income. But it's where their costs are distributed that makes the big difference. Joe's has much, much higher variable costs and relying very little on fixed, where Mike has a lot of his costs up front and fixed costs and relies very little on the variable costs. So our degree of operating leverage for each company, this is pretty simple to do. Remember, you take your contribution margin and divide it by your net income, 1.85, a relatively low number. Whereas this guy is over that 3 mark, he's going to have a much higher operating leverage. So meaning if sales go up, that's going to really help him. But if sales go down, it really hurts him that much worse. So let's prove it. Let's do an example of a 10% drop in sales. With Joe, if I had a 10% drop, so that's going to take me from 300,000 and then take 10% of that, so that takes me down to 270. I don't have to go through the entire and fill all this out again, because I'd have to figure out, okay, what's my variable cost compared to sales? With this degree of operating leverage, I can actually skip a step, skip all that, and just do one final little calculation that says, all right, a 10% drop. What we need to do is take our degree of operating leverage, multiply that by how my sales changed, and then that's going to tell me how much my net income is going to change. So with a 10% drop in sales, my net income is going to drop by 18.5%. And we could work this out, and I may do that in class, but I won't do that right here to save the video length. So if I take my net income, 65,000, multiply that by the 18.5%, that's a $12,000 decrease. Take 12,000 off of my net income, leaves me with at 52,000. So my sales go down 10, my net income goes down even further. So that's with a company that doesn't have much risk. With Mike, the company has a higher risk. So when you take his operating leverage times the downturn in sales, his net income is going to go down almost 40% compared to only 18.5 here. So we take the almost 40% times his net income. He's decreasing 25,000 off of his net income, bringing us from 65 down to only 39, compared to Joe, which he didn't lose nearly as much. Mike lost a lot more money because he's not able to save on variable costs. Mike was able to save quite a bit in variable costs. So actually I did go ahead and work it out here, so I didn't have to spend the time. But this is the proof. And I could show this in class how I got some of these answers, but a 10% decline here, what I needed to do, and I took 10% of my variable costs. So I'm not, as you can see here, my variable costs, 40,500 compared to 45,000. I'm not saving much. I lost 30,000 in sales, but I'm only saving 4,500 in variable cost. That's not a good position to be in. Whereas with the fixed costs, I'm not saving anything. Doesn't matter if my sales go up or down, those costs are going to be the same. And as you can see, within a very reasonable rounding distance, my net income do match what I showed here in my quick little formula. And then the final question here that I ask is, what is the break even in dollars? Remember, this is just good practice for doing break even again. First thing, if we're looking for dollars, we always have to find our contribution margin ratio first. And this is using pre-numbers, pre-10% drop. So take the 120 divided by the 300,000 in sales, 40%. Compared to Mike, he makes quite a bit of money per every sale. For every dollar he makes, 85 cents goes right to his bottom line. So he has a great contribution margin ratio. Whereas Joe, every dollar he makes, only 40 cents goes to his bottom line. Less risky, but less reward. Right, so then we can do the sales dollars, just take the fixed costs divided by our contribution margin ratio. And our final piece here, finding the margin of safety. Margin of safety is our last new topic. The margin of safety is very easy. Just take your actual sales minus what we just determined, the break even in sales, and do just like we do all the other ratios, divide it again by your actual sales. So I just found for Joe the 137.5 was our break even. This is actually our margin, our safety margin, where we're at, how much in sales we're at, minus what we could get down to and still at least break even. So I have 162.5. If you combine these, I believe that's going to be 162.5 in margin of safety. And then when you do the ratio, you divide it over the sales, our starting number. So our margin of safety ratio is 0.54. What that's saying here, and I'll come down here first, Joe, because he's less risky, less reward, he can stomach a really high drop in revenues and still at least be able to break even. Whereas Mike, he has a much less safety, margin of safety. His actual sales minus where he can only drop down to and still break even, that's only just over 75,000 compared to the 160 some up here. That's only a 25%. So he can only decrease 25% in revenue in order to not begin to become very, very bad off. All right, with that, we will continue on examples in class and finish the one in this notes, as well as do our the next example, the practice one. And then to end the day, we'll have our get out of class example. And that is it for today. Thank you.